In today's video, I want to discuss Citta the Householder. Who was he and why was he important in early Buddhism? I think we'll come to see that he had a really interesting role to play. If you're new to this channel, by the way, and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, calmer lay life perhaps, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. I take it that you are probably a layperson, probably not a monastic. There may be some monastics watching this, and maybe they can learn something too from the example of Citta the Householder. What I will say is that in early Buddhism, there was a very bright line between being a monastic on the one hand and being a householder, a layperson on the other. The distinction was, again, clear that the monastics had to hold to a large group of rules and laws, the monastic code, whereas lay people obviously didn't. They had a much smaller group of rules that they should follow, and I've done earlier videos on all of that. But the general idea was that there was a reciprocal relationship between the monastics and the lay people. The lay people were there to donate money, food, lodging, medicine, the requisites that the monastics required to live, because the monastics were not allowed by the monastic code to provide those things for themselves. They were not allowed to grow food, they were not allowed to cook food, that kind of thing. And the reciprocal point was that the monastics were to teach the Dharma to the lay people. And so the Buddha set up this kind of reciprocal relation between the two so that they would not become too separate, because it would not be healthy for the Sangha to remain completely isolated off in the forest somewhere with no contact with the lay people. That way they would fall out of disseminating the ideas of the Dharma around, right? They would just simply be off by themselves. The lay people would not learn anything about the Dharma, and that would not be healthy for either one. But this early Buddhist setup has sometimes led some people to believe that it's somehow inappropriate for lay people, perhaps such as myself, to be giving Dharma talks, that the Dharma, teaching the Dharma, was the sort of the sole purview of the monastic. But if we look at the early texts, that is not the case. And exhibit number 1 in this not being the case is Citta the Householder, Citta of Machisakanda. Citta was, in the Buddha's words, the foremost among householders in teaching the Dharma. And there's a whole chapter on Citta's teachings in the Samyutta Nikaya, and this is called the Citta Samyutta. That's the chapter about the teachings of Citta the Householder, or the experiences that he's had, including several teachings. And in that chapter we read about Citta's experiences, his abilities, and so on, and through it we get a pretty interesting picture of what a layperson was capable of achieving during the Buddha's day. For example, Citta says that he was an expert on achieving jhana, that he could achieve all of the jhanas, and was very good at doing that. Now, the jhanas, what are the jhanas? The jhanas are 4 stages of ever-deepening meditative absorption. And they were the sorts of things that, generally speaking, were the purview of monastics, because monastics in the Buddha's day were really the only people, well, mostly the only people who would have had the time, the inclination to devote to the kind of hours and hours of meditation it would take to achieve these kinds of states. However, Citta seems to have been somebody with the wealth that would allow him to take time off to be able to achieve such states, and he had the interest and ability. He is also said to have expressed that he was what's called a non-returner. That's a very technical term, which basically means that on the traditional kind of measure of how far you are along the path, he was basically one step from enlightenment, one step from being an arahant. That is to say, in the traditional understanding, he would not be born again in this world. I did an earlier video on these traditional stages of practice. I'll leave a link to that video down below in case that kind of thing interests you. In any event, in several of these early teachings involving Citta, these involve a kind of strange coincidences that remain unexplained and sort of give a certain kind of flavor to the stories, which I think is quite, I would say, partly confusing in any event. But let's discuss them. There are 3 of these stories that involve youthful monastics, the youngest monastic in the Sangha. The first 2 of these involve a young monastic named Isidatta. So it's said that Citta got together with a group of monastics and was having a discussion with them, and eventually that discussion devolved into essentially Citta asking riddles, monastic or dharmic riddles of his audience. What does this mean? Expecting to see whether anybody in the audience knew the Dharma deeply enough to be able to answer his question. And so he asked of his audience a riddle, and nobody could answer, except for Isidatta. In other words, Isidatta, being the most junior monastic, obviously would not have tried to answer immediately. He sort of stayed in the background, but since none of the more senior monastics could answer, he eventually spoke up and gave the right answer. And it's said that Citta was thrilled that one of the monastics knew the answer to his question, and so happily served them all food at the end. Now, of course, he would have, we assume, served them food either way, but in this example, he was happier and served them food happily. And it's also said after that first encounter that the senior monastic in attendance took Isidatta aside after this whole thing and said to him, "Isidatta, it's good that you felt inspired to answer that question because I didn't. So when a similar question comes up, you should also answer it as you feel inspired." So what we're seeing here is a kind of an interesting back and forth between the most senior and the most junior monastic, where the senior monastic's basically telling Isidatta that wasn't a problem that he spoke up, and indeed he should always feel free to speak up when he knows the answer to a question, especially if he as a senior monastic doesn't know the answer. So that's nice. Now, the second of these occurrences happens much the same way. That is, that a bunch of monks are in attendance at Citta's house. I assume it's Citta's house. In any event, Citta asks a Dharma riddle. Nobody can answer it except for Isidatta, who again is the most junior monastic. And when this happens for the second time, Citta then looks to Isidatta and basically asks him, what's your name? Isidatta says, "I'm Isidatta." Then Citta says, "I used to know a young man, Isidatta, back many years ago who was interested in joining the monastery, came from this town. Are you that Isidatta?" And Isidatta says, "Yes, that's who I am." And Citta is thrilled and says, "Well, given how smart you are and all the rest of your abilities, I will happily support you in the monastery. I'll give you all the robes you need, the food, I'll give you what you need as a monastic. I'll sort of support you." One assumes that this is the kind of thing that might have happened from time to time if a layperson was particularly thrilled with a monastic, how they comported themselves, that they might support them. So in any event, the weird thing is that once this happens, it says that after they had been served food and left, Isidatta walked off by himself, never to return. So he ended up not being supported by Citta and not returning at all to the monastery. And another strange occurrence mirrors this one in many ways in Citta's life. In this other occurrence, Citta is once again giving food to a bunch of monastics who are in residence, or at least visiting his house, I assume. And after having fed them, then he decides to walk back with them to the monastery. Presumably he's going to go back with them to the monastery and perhaps listen to a Dharma talk or what have you. But apparently it says that it was swelteringly hot. It was probably during the hot season of India. Extremely hot. Everyone was really melting in the heat on the way back to the monastery. But it's said that one junior monastic, the most junior monastic, had some kind of, it's said, magical ability to cause a cool wind to blow and all of a sudden for it to start raining, which was out of season. And this young monastic, I believe the name is Mahaka, when Mahaka and the rest of them and Citta go back to the monastery, Citta asks Mahaka, can you do other forms of magic, other incredible wonders for me? And Mahaka is able to do one or two amazing things to dazzle Citta. And so once again it's said that Citta said, oh, this is wonderful, Mahaka, I will support you in the Sangha, I will give you the robes you need and the food and everything you need to be a monastic, because clearly you have great abilities. And once again it's said that after this, Mahaka left the monastery never to return. So we have two examples of the most junior monastic who was a prodigy of a certain kind within the monastery, being lauded by Citta and then leaving never to return. Neither or none of these examples are explained in the suttas, so I think we have to leave it as a question as to what exactly happened here or why, or we might think perhaps they were shy people and didn't like, perhaps Isidatta didn't like being discovered as Isidatta, as a particular person from a particular place, and so he was shy and didn't like that. Who knows? In another very famous story, it was Citta who was the one that showed up a man named Nyanaponika, who was the leader of the Jain community. The Jains are a separate religion within India at the time. In fact, they were pre-Buddhist, and there still are Jains in India today. And Nyanaponika is the name we find in the Buddhist texts for a Jain leader known as Mahavira. And it's said that Citta went to listen to Nyanaponika and got into a discussion with him, and Citta essentially made it clear in that discussion that he had achieved the jhanas and understood them in a way that Nyanaponika did not. And that this was, at least from the Buddhist telling, a great defeat of Mahavira in front of his Jain audience. So it was really quite an important moment for the Buddhist Sangha. It's later said that when Citta was on his deathbed, he is said to have been visited by the Devas who offered to, who discussed with him the possibility that he would be reborn as a wheel-turning monarch. This is an expression in early Buddhism that basically means that you're reborn as an extremely powerful monarch who essentially unites all of the regions around where they are, extremely powerful, but who rules justly, who rules out of Dharma, not out of injustice. And it's said that Citta refused that because he understood that that was to look for a future of being a wheel-turning monarch was to basically grasp change, grasp things that are impermanent, that are always going to be decaying, and that was not his correct future, really, that he was a non-returner, he was not going to return to this world. Finally, I think it's important to mention that the Buddha, when discussing Citta, analogized him to Sariputta. In other words, what the Buddha said is that Citta should be your beacon, the person you should hold up as your standard as a layperson, in the same way that a monastic should hold up Sariputta as their standard. And that's a very, very high term of praise because Sariputta was known as the monastic, really the person who was greatest in wisdom among the Buddha's disciples. So what he's saying is that Citta basically is the Sariputta of lay people. Now, having said all that, I think we can gain a picture of how important Citta was in the early Sangha. If you're interested in hearing more about Citta's interaction with Nyanaponika, I actually did a separate video on that very topic, where the video includes a discussion of Citta's interaction with Nyanaponika. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen in case you want to see it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and get something in return. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.